Hello. We come to our 10th and last class. Today today is the class set aside for the second book of Chronicles, or properly the second half of the book of Chronicles, a single work as we mentioned last week. Um, Today I would like to spend our time looking at some of the contrasts between the approach of the books of Chronicles and the approach of Kings, um, which are set out in the third page of the notes that I sent you. Please make certain that you have the second set of notes that I sent out with the announcement of this lecture, since I had to rework the notes from before. I discovered going through them that they were more confusing than they needed to be, and so I tried to rework them to make them more useful to you. I don't exactly know how they got to be so mixed up, but they certainly did get to be mixed up, so I hope that these will be better. Anyway, I'm on the third page of the notes, and last week, if you recall, we went through the beginning part of the books of Chronicles through the genealogies, and then we took a look at the presentation of King Saul, which is really, in important ways, preparatory to the more extended narrative portions of the books. Though, as it was perfectly clear, I hope, last week, the genealogies are an important part of the actual content of the book, and an important part of what the book of Chronicles is trying to show its readers, still in terms of telling stories and content that people can recall to mind without needing to look it up. At least if you're like me, I'm not good at having genealogies stick in my mind, at least other people's genealogies. I'm better with my own genealogy because I was drilled by my grandmother. But the narrative parts, the stories about kings who are mentioned elsewhere and their adherents, those are the parts that I think were more commonly recounted, both in ancient times and modern ones as well. So once those narrative parts begin, then the question arises, is there a real difference between the books of Chronicles and the books of Kings? Um, if so, what is the difference? And the end of Samuel too here comes in, and the question is, if there is a difference, what is the difference, and from where does the difference come? What is the reason for the difference? If you have that book of Old Testament parallels, then you can look very easily to see where the accounts differ and overlap. But as with a gospel synopsis, looking at a synopsis is not good enough for understanding what's really going on in these Old Testament books. You need to look at the books themselves first, and then you have a better chance of understanding the comparison you might make between books. You can never skip over the part of getting to know the books themselves. However, since we only have 10 classes and this is the 10th one, if we don't get to that comparison stage today, we never will. So I am, as a matter of fact, skipping over that part that I'm telling you not to skip, because in order for this workshop type approach to be successful, I have to actually show you what I think I have in mind when I'm talking about doing this. Long experience of teaching has made me realize that when I think I'm being very clear is oftentimes when I'm not being very clear. And so the way to get around that problem is to actually do things with people, then you know that they've done them. And so that's what we're going to do today. So we begin here on, we're looking at Satterthwaite and McConville in in their chapter 11 where they lay out, they have 24 pages of sort of discussing how Chronicles works and how to look at it. A number of useful collections of materials there. As you know now, after weeks of reading, I'm a very bad typist. If I were a better typist, I would have typed for you some of these clusters of material that they offer um, that can help you appreciate Chronicles and in and of themselves, and also how they compare to other books. Um, I suggest this series that includes Satterthwaite and McConville is a series that I believe there are 4 Old Testament volumes and 2 New Testament volumes, and I really do think everyone should own them. They're not tremendously expensive for how useful they are, and I think you will be very pleased to own them. So I encourage you to buy all these volumes, buy the 4 Old Testament volumes. But we begin here on page 275 with a particular comparison. I mean, the way you get a sense of how the books, there are 2 ways in which books can differ, right? If they're covering the same territory. One way, of course, is in the choice of material. That well, we saw last week, the book of Chronicles has very little on King Saul. There are stories about King Saul clustered right around his being killed, right? But it would have been possible, certainly, for the author of Chronicles to leave Saul out. You might mention him in a verse, after the death of King Saul, then X, off we go with David. If that had been the choice, then that would be one very clear choice the choice that was made to pretty much leave Saul out entirely. There's a lot of Saul material in Samuel. There's very little in Chronicles. And so that's the first choice, is including versus not including. The second choice is, if 2 things are equally included, how are they presented? How are they made use of? And what is the larger picture into which they fit? We're going to try to get some of that understanding from a number of comparisons that we're going to do today. The first one is this one here that Satterthwaite and McConville offer on their page 275. The first 2 chapters of the first book of Kings and those 3 chapters of First Chronicles, in the way that they present the process by which Solomon takes over after David is gone. Right? So the more complex presentation of this process is in Kings. In these comparisons, for consistency's sake, I talked some last time about the difficulty of deciding really if Chronicles is earlier than Kings. I think linguistically, the Hebrew of Chronicles seems to be, to me, being nobody's idea of a Hebrew expert, later than that of Kings. So linguistically, at least, I would think that Chronicles is later, though if you've taken a full Old Testament class, whether in our seminary or elsewhere, you'll know that dating by language and style can be very tricky, because these ancient books were frequently reworked, and so could reflect a later period than the one in which they were actually produced. But anyway, let's look quickly here at the first 2 chapters of Kings. So King David is old and advanced in years. He couldn't get warm, so they get Abishag the Shunammite, an attractive young girl, to snuggle up to him because they don't have rubber, so they don't have hot water bottles, right? And so she is his hot water bottle. But verse 4, the king knew her not. That's important politically. We'll see later how that works. It's not court gossip. They don't tell you, oh, he didn't have sex with her, just so you know, the way People magazine would, right? That's important for political reasons in their culture, and we'll look at that later. So meanwhile, off stage, Adonijah, one of the sons of David, is making a play for the kingship by presenting himself as a kingly figure. So Adonijah, the son of Haggith, that's his mother, of course, they're all sons of David, right? Exalted himself, saying, I will be king. And he gets chariots and horsemen, 50 men to run before him so he can go around in a procession, right? His father had never at any time displeased him by asking, and he was spoiled. He'd never been denied anything he wanted, and he looked very good, which is clearly important for this kind of stuff. Absalom looked good. We know that Saul looked very kingly. This kind of stuff is still important. In our presidential election yesterday, maybe this didn't figure, but scholars have noted over time that generally speaking in democracies, taller people tend to get elected in preference to shorter people. As someone who's slightly less than average height, this perhaps explains why I was not elected yesterday. But anyway, it may not work if it's male-female comparison because there are different expectations. So anyway, he looks like a king, and he's never been made to back off from something that he wanted. And so he acts like a king and sort of gives himself permission. He confers with Joab, important military figure, Abiathar, the priest, and they go along with him. But Zadok the priest and Benaiah, another military figure, and Nathan the prophet, Shimei and Ray, and the mighty men didn't go along. So some of the king's adherents went along with Adonijah, but central ones, certainly from the point of view of the Bible, like Nathan, a major figure, did not. Right? So he sacrifices and invites people to come to the sacrifice, but he didn't invite Nathan and those other people. So in beginning here in verse 11 of chapter 1, Nathan huddles up with Bathsheba, the putative possible mother of the king, right? Mother of Solomon. Haven't you heard that this is going on? Let's go see what we can do. So on verse 15, they go to see the king in his chamber, and Bathsheba tells the king what's up, that he's done these sacrifices and he's gathering followers. And in comes Nathan the prophet in verse 22, and he comes in to consult too. He asks in verse 24, have you said my Adonijah shall reign after me? Is this something we should know about, or is this Adonijah's own idea? And so they're feasting with him and saying, long live King Adonijah, which sounds like a pretty clear claim to future rule, if not a claim to present rule. It's not necessarily a coup, but it's, when the king is old enough so he's sort of in his bedroom only with his attendants, it's things that might not be threatening are even more threatening. So anyway, this is what's going on. So Solomon arranges, or David arranges for Solomon to be brought forward, right? So in verse 28, the king says, call Bathsheba to me. So in comes the woman, and Solomon shall reign after me. And she says, thank you very much. Verse 32, get me Zadok the priest, Nathan the prophet, Benaiah the son of Jehoiada. Again, that's priest, prophet, soldier, right? He's getting the core leaders of the different branches of the common life of the children of Israel together, getting them ready to send them out to solve this problem. And he tells them, let Zadok the priest in verse 34, let Zadok the priest and Nathan the prophet anoint him, blow the trumpet and say, long live King Solomon, and publicly proclaim him as the future ruler. Or these kings overlap, that the kings can kind of retire and their sons take over. That's what seems to be going on here. And we'll see more of that later if we get through enough of these examples where kings can overlap with each other. And so out goes Zadok the priest and Nathan and Benaiah in verse 38, and they get a bunch of people to ride on King David's mule in 38. Just a quick note. In Europe, kings and warriors ride on horses and servants ride on mules. In the Middle East, especially in this early period, this is before there were a lot of camels around, especially in this early period, the royal animal, interestingly enough, is a donkey. This is why that you hear a lot of Holy Week sermons about Jesus riding the humble ass, into the that. But in our culture, we think Jesus is being humble. In their culture, it's a proclamation of kingship. Hallelujah, blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord. It's actually a proclamation of kingship. It's not humility. So that's a misinterpretation that you hear very frequently in Holy Week based on our culture trying to apply it to a foreign culture. Um, having Solomon ride on David's mule is a sign of Solomon taking the place of David as the king. So they do all these things, and they have a horn of oil and all this stuff. And when Joab and Adonijah and the people with him, verse 41, hear what's going on, there's another proclamation going on. And notice when they list, they say in verse 43, no, our Lord King David has made Solomon king. The king has sent with him Zadok the priest, Nathan the prophet, Benaiah the son of Jehoiada, the Kerethites and the Pelethites. They made him ride on the king's mule. They're telling you all those things because those are specific elements of this presentation of Solomon to the people as the king, as the rightful. So this is why they all tremble and go their own way, verse 49, because their attempt to put Adonijah forward has been countered by the king's attempt to put Solomon forward, which has more pull with the people. So when that gets us to chapter 2, okay? This is already a pretty complicated process with some back and forth, right? And we're not done yet. We've got a whole nother chapter. So this is not just David writes his will, I'm leaving the kingdom to Solomon. Everybody says, thank goodness, what a great guy. I always liked him. And then he takes over, right? There's already been kind of not quite coup and not quite counter coup, but something very like that. They're managing to do this so far with no bloodshed, which is interesting. Of course, it's all in the family. Sometimes that makes it more bloody, and sometimes it makes it less bloody. So far, it seems to be less bloody, which is a good thing. I'm going to try to make the light work better. I don't know if this will help. Maybe a little. Okay. So now we're in chapter 2. Maybe that's worse. I don't know. Clearly, we've never solved the problem. Sunny days are easier in here than rainy days, and we have a rainy, windy day out here. So, but we're doing the best we can. Okay, so David's time to die draws near. In verse 1 of chapter 2, he commands Solomon, his son, be strong and show yourself a man. Keep the charge. He gives him instructions as fathers should when they're leaving their sons behind. Know about Joab and act according to your wisdom. We saw this before. He commands essentially the execution of Joab in verse 6, which is really kind of a bad thing to do. Having put up with Joab for his whole life, he then tells his son to do away with him. We talked about that when we did the books of Kings. And we talked about the picture of David in there. Anyway, he gives him specific instructions. Then David dies and is buried in the city of David. And here comes, so Solomon is becoming king now, right? In verse 13 of chapter 2. Adonijah, the son of Haggith, came to Bathsheba, the mother of Solomon, right? They're all, get your mother, talk to someone else's mother and stuff. My mother is gone now, but so now I get my wife to talk to people. That works. In our culture, like in their culture, if you talk to somebody's mother, you're getting the real stuff. So Adonijah sends his mother, or goes to talk to the mother of Solomon, and he says, I'm coming peacefully. I have something to say to you. Everybody thought I was going to reign, so all I want is Abishag the Shunammite as my wife, right? Since I don't get the kingdom, just give me the pretty girl, right? And then I'll go away. Bathsheba says, I'll ask the king, right? So that doesn't sound, she's not I don't think we're not told specifically that she's a slave. She's a servant girl. But I guess, it's all in the family and stuff. So he says, can I have the servant girl? Presumably as a concubine. Um, Bathsheba goes to King Solomon, verse 19, to speak to him on behalf of Adonijah. And so she sits down, a sign of where she fits in the scheme of things, which is very high. I have one small request to make. Let Abishag the Shunammite be given to Adonijah your brother as his wife. Why do you ask Abishag the Shunammite for Adonijah? Ask for him the kingdom also. He's my older brother, and he's already got Abiathar the priest and Joab the son of Zeruiah, right? Why does he respond that way? In the Middle Eastern culture, one of the ways of passing down a crown, and this is, we don't know, all we have is the Bible for the Jews, right? But for Israel. But in a number of other cultures we know, and they're always, of course, affected by this, everybody's political ideas go back and forth. One of the ways to pass down a throne is for the person who's the successor to take, all these kings have harems, right? To take the harem of the king as his own. And by possessing the women of the previous person, that's a political way of taking over the position of that person, the previous position of the person. One of the ways you do this, by the king dies and leaves a widow, and you marry the king's widow, and that makes you king. That's one of the ways you take over, and that seems to be functioning here. This is, Adonijah presents this as a personal request. I don't get the kingdom, all I want's the girl, right? But in their culture, getting the girl is very close to getting the kingdom. This goes back to the first mention of Abishag. This is why they said the king did not know her. If the king knew her, she would have been not only one of his women, but his woman at the end of his life. So taking her afterwards would have been taking the place of David, and that would be very close to taking David's place as king. That's why I said they're not interested in, it's not gossip. This is political information that he doesn't know Abishag. That's important. We don't know whether or not Adonijah knew that, or whether the people in general knew that. And so this is one of the ways in which we're being given information that it's one of those cases in which the narrator may tell you more than the characters in the story know. But this explains why Solomon is so taken aback for this, by this request. So the next verse, after where we picked up, verse 23 in chapter 2, King Solomon swore by the Lord, saying, may God do so to me and more also, may God do away with me if this word does not cost Adonijah his life, because Adonijah is making a play for the crown. So Adonijah shall be put to death today. So verse 25, King Solomon sent Benaiah, the son of Jehoiada, the soldier guy, and he struck him down and he died. So that's the execution of Adonijah. And then to Abiathar the priest, the king said, go out of town. You deserve death, but I won't put you to death because you carried the ark before my father. Abiathar is a holy, set aside for the Lord person. So he sends him away rather than executing him. And then Joab here, there's a longer process by which Joab gets killed, right? And then things sort of sort out. Things sort of sort out over the rest. We won't go through the Shimei stuff. But at the end of chapter 2, the final sentence is, so the kingdom was established in the hand of Solomon, right? It's clear from the tale in Kings that Adonijah makes two separate political efforts at taking over the throne. And that the first is rebuffed by David himself after Bathsheba intervenes, and the second is rebuffed by Solomon himself, again after Bathsheba intervenes. It's interesting. Bathsheba, I've never heard I don't know if anyone preaches on Bathsheba other than, David's sin with Uriah, against Uriah the Hittite, but Bathsheba is clearly politically important at the time that Solomon's taking over. So anyway, that's what Kings gives us of the actual process by which you get from David being the king to Solomon being the recognized king. And it's extended and multifaceted and complicated, and the way it's presented to us, if you don't see the hand of the Lord deciding that Solomon's going to win out, it could go either way, right? Let's take a look at Chronicles now. 1 Chronicles 22. Okay, this is 1 Chronicles 22. David's just had done the census and then built an altar after the census and the calamity and all the people dying from the plague. So, chapter 22 in 1 Chronicles, David said, here shall be the house of the Lord God, and here the altar of burnt offering for Israel. So David prepares for building the temple. He commands to gather together the resident aliens because he's going to put them to work. And he has lots of, materials, bronze and iron. And okay, so that's through verse 5. Then in verse 6, he called for Solomon his son and charged him to build a house for the Lord, the God of Israel. And he tells him, I wanted to build the house for the Lord, but the Lord said, no, your son's going to do it. So verse 11, now my son, the Lord be with you, so you may succeed in building the house of the Lord. And then in verse 17, David commands all the leaders of Israel to help Solomon his son, so that Solomon will be able to take over. So then here we get 23. So before David is old and full of days, which is the beginning of 23, we're about to skip that. Before that, you have a whole chapter whereby David is looking forward to the rule of Solomon, getting ready for it. Solomon's got a role. It's going to be a primarily religious role as the builder of the temple. All of this is being set up. He's organizing it all. Okay, then we get to 28. David assembles at Jerusalem all the officials of Israel, the officials of the tribes, and of the divisions that serve the king. That's his, we would say, the different branches of the bureaucracy, right, are the divisions that serve the king. Stewards of all the property and the livestock and all that kind of stuff. So David rises to his feet, verse 2. Hear me, my brothers and my people. I had it in my heart to build a house of rest for the Ark of the Covenant. Again, this is now a public announcement about the building of the temple. But God said to me, verse 3, you may not build a house for my name because you're a man of war and has shed blood. So he said to me, verse 8, it's Solomon your son who shall build my house and my courts. I've chosen him to be my son, and I will be his father, says the Lord. Right? So, you, Solomon, my son, verse 9 says, David, know the God of your father, serve him with a whole heart. And then in verse 11, David gives Solomon the plan of the vestibule of the temple, the blueprints, I guess, right, for him that he can use to have all the workmen do that. It's all divided up, the treasuries and the divisions and the weight of all the different things, of all the furniture that need to be built for it. So so it's all laid out. Solomon just has to do it, right? And then verse 20, David says, be strong and courageous and do it. Don't be afraid. Don't be dismayed. So then chapter 29, David says to the whole assembly, Solomon, my son, is young and inexperienced. The work is great. So I provided for the house of my God. He goes through again all the, the things that have been laid out. all of the materials he has. He prays in the assembly, verse 10. And, is this act of worship before everyone. Bless the Lord your God. Verse 20, in the assembly, bless the Lord, the God of their fathers. And they offered sacrifices, bulls, rams, and lambs. And they make Solomon, the son of David, king in the second part of verse 22. They anointed him as prince for the Lord and Zadok as priest. So Solomon sits on the throne as king in place of his father, and all Israel obeyed him. So then they're off and running, right? In verse 23 of chapter 29, that is. Again, a multi-step process. It begins before David is a debilitated king. David is thinking the whole way through in an organized way, setting things up for Solomon to be the king, which is not the way it comes in Kings. Where's Adonijah? There's no Adonijah in this. Where's the attempted getting rid of Solomon? There's no attempted getting rid of Solomon. Where's the politics? You could say there's no politics. This is all, David has this primary central goal of his life, building the temple, and the Lord doesn't allow him to. So he prepares his son to take his place and do it. The Lord has previously told him to do this. He announces it to the Lord. He announces it to the people who work for him, who are going to build the temple. He announces it to the priests. He announces it to the people. Everybody gets all set up, and then everybody recognizes Solomon as the king. Right? The Chronicles picture is completely centered on religious concerns. It is, again, a relatively long process, but it is not a process with any stress or tension in it. There's no question that this is going to end with Solomon being the king. This is a completely different story. Now, would it be possible to lay these stories over each other and have a combined account? Well, as a matter of fact, they are essentially mutually exclusive, are they not? I mean, they're talking about completely different things. This is not a case, I think, in which, given our state of information, we have to choose between Chronicles or Kings. They are not different accounts of the same particular events. They are different accounts of different events surrounding the same process by which you start with David and you end up with Solomon. Chronicles is interested in the temple in characteristic fashion, and Kings is interested in the king's stuff in characteristic fashion. But they are not at odds with each other. They are just parallel, but they really don't intersect. It's very interesting to do something like that. Now, not all of the comparisons work this way. That's why I want to do more than one. I don't want to give you the idea that every time you put Chronicles next to Kings, they're parallel and they don't overlap, because that's not true. But it's very interesting to see something as important as the only successful, peaceful handing over of the throne of David from one person to another, David to Solomon, as being presented in two very different ways. That's, when you think, and as I'm sure you do, when you sit alone in your room and think about Solomon taking over from David, if you're like me, you just think of one thing. I think of the Adonijah stuff, because I think about Abishag, the Shunammite girl, and explaining that to students, and so that I always remember that I have to do that. So that's the story that I think about, and I don't think about the Chronicles one, even though I know it's there. It's an interesting contrast. So let's skip on down, go to page 278, and then we have a number of other parallels here. Asa, good King Asa, who doesn't get nearly as much recognition as he should. Let's look at good King Asa in 1 Kings 15. This is interesting. These are, as Satterthwaite and McConville remind us, there are not too many kings come out looking good in the Book of Kings. Most of the kings are pretty disastrous, and Asa is a good king. So let's look at how Asa looks in the Book of Kings, and then how Asa looks in Chronicles. 1 Kings 15. We only have 15 verses, so it won't take us too long. 1 Kings 15, starting at verse 9. In the 20th year of Jeroboam, king of Israel, the northern kingdom, Asa began to reign over Judah, the southern kingdom. That's the northern and southern part comes from me. That's not the ESV. And he reigned 41 years in Jerusalem. His mother's name was Maacah, the daughter of Abishalom. My father is peace. And Asa did what was right in the eyes of the Lord, as David his father had done. He put away the male cult prostitutes out of the land, good for him. Removed all the idols his fathers had made. He removed Maacah, his mother, from being queen mother because she made an image for Asherah. She was engaged in idol worship, so he got rid of his mother. A good sign for a king, not being pushed around by your mother. And Asa cut down her image and burned it at the brook Kidron, which is a way of purifying as well as getting rid of course. But the high places were not taken away, so that people still could go onto the tops of hills and sacrifice on those flat platforms that we talked about to the Lord, we think, but not in ways that they're supposed to, not at the temple. Okay. Nevertheless, the heart of Asa was wholly true to the Lord all his days. And he brought into the house of the Lord the sacred gifts of his father and his own sacred gifts, silver, gold, and vessels. So he gave to the support of the temple. Okay. And there's war between Asa and Baasha, the king of Israel, all their days. So he's fighting with the northern kingdom all the time. Asa takes the silver and gold, verse 18, that was left in the treasures of the house of the Lord, and he sends it to the king of Syria in Damascus, saying, let there be a covenant, let's make a treaty, you and me, instead of you and the northern kingdom, so that you be my ally and we'll have the king of Israel, the northern kingdom, in between us. And so he goes together with the king in Damascus. And so he gets rid of Ramah, which had been the place that Baasha, the king of Israel, had built up against, it's kind of a border guard against his own kingdom. And the rest of the acts of Asa, all his might, verse 23, and all that he did in the cities he built, are they not written in the book of the Chronicles of the kings of Judah? Yes. But in his old age he was diseased in his feet. Okay, so that's Asa. He took away, his heart was true to the Lord. He was zealous in supporting right worship to the point of putting away his mother from the court because she was involved in idol worship. He didn't manage to get rid of the high places, but he did what he could. He fought with the northern kingdom and made an alliance with Syria against it, and which was quite successful because it made the northern kingdom take down Ramah, which he had set up, to sort of put pressure on Asa and his kingdom. And at the end of his life, he had sore feet. Okay, let's look at 2 Chronicles 14 through 16. Asa reigns in Judah, 2 Chronicles. Abijah slept with his fathers, and they buried him in the city of David. Asa, his son, reigned in his place. This is the beginning of chapter 14. In his days, the land had rest for 10 years. Asa did what was good and right in the eyes of the Lord his God. He took away the foreign altars and high places, broke down the pillars, cut down the Asherim, commanded Judah to seek the Lord, to keep the law and the commandment. He took also out of all the cities of Judah the high places and the incense altars. So they give him credit with getting rid of the incense altars. Out of the cities, there may still have been high places on the hilltops. But their Chronicles is giving him more credit. They're going on more with what he was able to do as far as purifying religion. The kingdom had rest under him. He built fortified cities in Judah, for the land had rest. He had no war in those years. The Lord gave him peace. So he built these cities, and he had an army, and they had shields and stuff like that. And that's great. And here comes Zerah the Ethiopian in verse 9. We didn't hear about him at all. And with an army of 1,000,000 men and 300 chariots. I talked before about numbers in the Bible. I don't think there's any way that Ethiopia shows up with 1,000,000 men. But anyway, we already talked about that. And they got pretty far as Marishah, and Asa went out to meet him, and he cried to the Lord, which is a very good thing to do, certainly in the opinion of Chronicles. So the Lord, verse 12, defeats the Ethiopians before Asa and before Judah, and they flee. The Lord defeats them because Asa cried out to him. And they pursued them and wiped them out, and they attacked all the cities around there, and they plundered the cities, and so it's a big success. Then, so he has military success, which we did not hear about before. It's interesting that Chronicles, which you might think would all, tell us more about the purifying of religion, Chronicles has this quite lengthy military narrative. Everybody likes military history. I guess, men like military history. So I guess the men who were writing Chronicles, for the men who are going to read Chronicles, put in some good military stuff. Anyway, Asa's religious reforms, chapter 15, the Spirit of God comes upon him, and Azariah comes out to speak to Asa and says to encourage him to seek the Lord and stuff. And so they do. As soon as Asa heard these words, verse 8, the prophecy of Azariah the son of Oded, he took courage, put away all the detestable idols. This seems to be a flashback. This seems to be the story of how his religious purifications came about. Because if he'd previously done away with all the idols and stuff, he can't do away with all the idols now. Which is even more interesting then, because it seems that the chronicler wants to lead with the military stuff. I guess, get them interested, and then we'll give them. It always makes me think of Captain's Courageous, that wonderful novel about the fishing on the Grand Banks off of the Atlantic coast, where they don't have a Bible on Sunday, so they read from the works of Josephus, which the young boys who serve on the ship like even better than the Bible, because it has even more battles than the Bible. I think that's a great. I always remember that very strongly. Anyway, so they've led with. They've mentioned the purification, but then they lead with the military stuff. Now they're giving you the sort of detailed story of the religious purification. Put away the detestable idols, and repaired the altar of the Lord, which was in front of the vestibule of the house of the Lord. And he gathered all Judah and Benjamin. I'm in verse 9 of chapter 15. Gets everybody together, Ephraim, Manasseh, Simeon, and they gather at Jerusalem, and they sacrifice to the Lord all this stuff, 700 oxen, 7,000 sheep. And they enter into a covenant, and they swear an oath, and they blow trumpets and stuff. It's great stuff. And, okay, and then they tell you again that here that he got rid of his mother because she had the Asherah image, but the high places were not taken out of Israel, verse 17. The heart of Asa was true all his days. And then in the 36th year, chapter 16, Asa goes up against Judah and built Ramah, so he's building it back against them. And here we get the treaty with Syria against the northern kingdom, and the seer comes to tell him that because you went for help this time to the king of Syria instead of to the Lord of hosts, then things aren't going to be as well with you as they might be. So and Asa doesn't do the right thing. Here in verse 10, Asa's angry with the seer and put him in stocks in prison, for he was in a rage with him because of this, and he inflicted cruelties upon some of the people at the same time. So he's not perfect. Anyway, and He gets diseased in his feet, and he does not seek help from the Lord, but sought help from physicians, which is in the Old Testament is not what you're supposed to do. In my father's house growing up, since my father is a surgeon, that was what you're supposed to do, but they're not mutual exclusive now. We can be anointed and also go to the doctor. Anyway, and he dies after 41 years of reign. So, the differences. There's quite a bit of detail, of course, a much larger story of Asa in Chronicles than there is in Kings. Chronicles is very interested in the religious side of what he's doing. But how much more religious detail is there in Chronicles than there is in Kings? Kings has really quite a lot of the same religious stuff. We do get the depiction of making of a covenant, and we do get the depiction of the sacrifices emphasized in Chronicles. But Chronicles presents this is not a purely religious picture in the way that the story of Solomon's accession in Chronicles is a purely religious picture. And that's worth emphasizing because it's a mistake and an oversimplification to think that Chronicles is so interested in the religious side of things that other things do not enter into its accounts. That's not correct. And it's also interesting that both of these works, though they both present Asa as a good king, both of these works mention specific things he did not do that he should have. And Chronicles, which is more interested in religion than the other, right, has this verse 10 in chapter 16 of 2nd Chronicles, where he puts the seer in the stocks and inflicts cruelties upon some of the people. It's interesting that you get details of the misbehavior of Asa, which makes me think that these are being included because they are considered sinful, not because they're being, they are also, it's bad kingship to be sinful, so it's always bad kingship. But I think they're being included because they strike against the picture of his virtue rather than the picture of him as a good king. But that perhaps you might think that I'm misunderstanding those things, but that's the way I would understand it. Let's quickly look at Uzziah, and then maybe I'll have just a few minutes to say something general about all the historical books. It's interesting, Uzziah, Azariah, like Jacob, who also has a name Israel, and Paul, who also has a name Saul, and Peter, who also has a name Simon or Simeon. King Uzziah has two names. Let's look at 2 Kings 15 to get him first. In the year that King Uzziah died, right? That's Isaiah. So I always think about Uzziah as being someone I know about. Okay, so here is 2 Kings 15. And the first 7 verses are about Uzziah/Azariah. And this is where he's called Azariah. Okay. In the 27th year of Jeroboam, king of Israel, Azariah the son of Amaziah, the king of Judah, began to reign. He was 16 years old when he began to reign. He reigned 52 years in Jerusalem till he was 68. His mother's name was Jechaliah of Jerusalem. He did what was right in the eyes of the Lord, according to all that his father Amaziah had done. Nevertheless, the high places were not taken away. They can never seem to get rid of those illicit places of worship on the hilltops. The people still sacrificed and made offerings on the high places. The Lord touched the king, so he was a leper to the day of his death, and he lived in a separate house, which you have to do if you're a leper. Jotham, the king's son, was over the household, governing the people of the land. There's a perfect example. That's what I meant, talking about kings taking over and their reigns overlapping. One of the difficulties with chronology in a book like the Bible, or a collection of books like the Bible, is that You keep counting the years of Azariah being king when he's a leper and his son Jotham is governing the people of the land, but you also count years for Jotham if you want to. So you can have two kings in the same kingdom who are having their regnal years counted, and that's why it gets hard to figure out exactly where you are in BC and AD. Anyway, Azariah has to go apart, and people can't interact with him because he's unclean. So he lives in a little house, a little leper house, Lazar house, as they call it, for Lazarus. Lazarus the sick guy, not Lazarus the resurrected from the dead guy. And his son Jotham rules. Okay, so that's the whole Azariah story. Then let's look at Second Chronicles 26, where we will get more information about Uzziah slash Azariah. Okay, if you have the book I do, this is on page 777. Uzziah reigns in Judah, chapter 26 of Second Chronicles. Okay. And all the people of Judah took Uzziah, who was 16 years old, and made him king instead of his father Amaziah. That's how you know it's the same person, right? He built Aloth and restored it to Judah after the king slept with his fathers. Uzziah was 16 years old when he began to reign. He reigned 52 years in Jerusalem. His mother's name was Jechaliah of Jerusalem. Clearly the same person, there's no question. And the tradition is, the rabbis, everyone knows they're the same person. He did what was right in the eyes of the Lord, according to all that his father Amaziah had done. He set himself to seek God in the days of Zechariah, who instructed him in the fear of the Lord. As long as he sought the Lord, God made him prosper. He went out and made war against the Philistines, broke through the wall of Gath and the wall of Jabneh and the wall of Ashdod, so he conquered those cities. He built cities in the territory of Ashdod, and elsewhere among the Philistines he's moving into their territory, into the lowlands. God helped him against the Philistines and against the Arabians and against the Meunites. The Ammonites paid tribute to him, and his fame spread even to the border of Egypt. He became very strong. He built towers in Jerusalem, 3 different places. He built towers in the wilderness, cut out many cisterns, for he had large herds. So he's rich, and he's expanding his grazing, and he's building fortresses, both in the Shephelah, the lowlands, and in the plain. And he had farmers and vine dressers in the hills. He loved the soil. He was an energetic farmer. Moreover, Uzziah had an army of soldiers in divisions. The whole number of heads of the fathers' houses of mighty men of valor was 2,600. Under their command was an army of 307,500. So big, but again, I wouldn't take that number to the bank. Who could make war with mighty power? So he's got all the army shields, spears, helmets, coats of mail, bows, and stones for slinging, verse 14. In Jerusalem he made machines invented by skillful men to shoot arrows and great stones. So, catapults. But, here we go. So we have a great deal more detail already about the things that he did as a king, the practical things that made him richer and more powerful and able to extend his authority outwards. But here in 16, we're going to get a story that we didn't hear before at all. When he was strong, he grew proud to his destruction, for he was unfaithful to the Lord his God, and entered the temple of the Lord to burn incense on the altar of incense, which, not being a priest, he's not supposed to do. Azariah the priest went in after him with 80 priests of the Lord who were men of valor, and they withstood King Uzziah and said, "It's not for you, Uzziah, to burn incense to the Lord before the priests, the sons of Aaron. Go out of the sanctuary, you have done wrong. It will bring you no honor from the Lord God." So in verse 19, Uzziah is angry. He had a censer in his hand to burn incense. And when he became angry with the priests, leprosy broke out on his forehead in the presence of the priests in the house of the Lord by the altar of incense. And Azariah the chief priest and all the priests looked at him, and behold, he was leprous in his forehead. They rushed him out quickly because, of course, everything he touches is going to be unclean, right? And he himself hurried to go out because the Lord had struck him. Uzziah, in the midst of his misbehavior, realizes when he suddenly becomes leprous that he's kind of bit off more than he can chew, and so he doesn't resist when they're pushing him out. And King Uzziah was a leper to the day of his death, and being a leper lived in a separate house. For he was excluded from the house of the Lord, and from everywhere else too. And Jotham his son was over the king's household, governing the people of the land. So, we get, so we get the story, a specific story behind his leprosy, which is entirely religious in its circumstances. It's very interesting that the leprosy, which of course is an important political thing too, the leprosy appears in Kings, but there is no hint of it being anything other than a misfortune. Whereas in Chronicles, there's quite a long story. It's almost half of the Uzziah stuff about how he becomes a leper and he had it coming to him. And then here, just a quick note. Let's read the last of this because there's something I noticed here, starting in verse 22. Now the rest of the acts of Uzziah from first to last, Isaiah the prophet, the son of Amos, wrote, because Uzziah shows up in his book. Uzziah slept with his fathers. They buried him with his fathers in the burial field that belongs to the kings, for they said, he is a leper. I think there might be a knot missing there. They did not bury him with his fathers in the burial field that belongs to the kings, for they said he is a leper. Because, first of all, that would go along with him being unclean after he's dead, which is still true if you're a leper. And also, why would they say, oh, he's a leper, therefore we must bury him with his fathers? Does that mean that if he weren't a leper, they wouldn't bury him with his father? I think there's reason to think that there might be a missing knot there. Clearly it doesn't affect things enough so that the rabbis didn't fix it. But it just seems odd to me. So that's as many comparisons as we can make in this hour. This does seem to be one that a professor of Old Testament would be happy to call characteristic of the book of Chronicles, because the addition, which is the story of the source of, it's interesting, as before with Asa, Chronicles gives you more details about the practicalities at the same time that they give you more specific religious details that there was no hint of at all in Kings. So overlapping, yes, parallel also sometimes. You can see how they go together. Again, they're not at odds with each other. They're interestingly complementary, which is supports the idea that scholars and people back to the rabbis have had that which is why the Greek-speaking Jews who translated Chronicles into Greek gave it the title, as we began with, the things left over, the extra stuff left out of Kings that we're giving you now, right? Clearly it's not only that, because there's overlap. There are things in Chronicles and Kings, but there's a lot of material in Chronicles that is not in Kings. Okay, so now I only have 2 minutes. Let me just say before I let you go that one of the things we have seen is that in these historical books is that the category of historical book is not a category that really fits completely with the Bible. The Bible itself, the Old Testament, does not call these things historical books. They're writings. But of course, Daniel is a writing too. So is Psalms is a writing too. Psalms being completely theological. My point is that it's a mistake to think of these things as historical rather than theological, or historical rather than religious. In the same way that it's a mistake to think of something like the book of Isaiah as religious rather than historical. The children of Israel did not make that distinction. Their understanding, their basic theological understanding, I've got 30 seconds. Their basic theological understanding is of the Lord who works in history. God works in history, and the Bible is a record of some of the things that God does in history. Theology and history in the biblical tradition, and certainly up to the present day in Orthodox Christianity, are completely intertwined. So the biblical books are not a place you go to get away from theology in the Bible. They're a place where you see theology expressed and worked out in different ways. The historical books are just as theological as the Psalms or prophets or the Torah are. Um, and they will be misunderstood if you say, now let's read some history and get away from all that religion. Then you cannot understand these books correctly. You must always recognize that history and theology are intertwined and overlapped. God working in the world is a constant characteristic of the existence of the created world. God does not enter the world from the outside to make something miraculous happen. God reveals the fact that he's already there in the midst of the world when he makes something happen. I wish I had another hour just to beat you over the head with that one point. But I didn't want to let you go away with the wrong idea of history. So if you do a Bible study on a historical book with your people in a parish, the first thing you should say is, now we're going to do a historical book. Let me remind you that this does not mean that we're getting away from theology. This means we're seeing our theology in different ways, and it's being shown to us in different ways. Thank you for your patience for these 10 weeks. I hope that you've learned as much as I have. It's always very useful to go over these things again. And please communicate with me if there's something more that I can do to help you. Thank you.